What they discovered shook the royal family to its core. Nobody prepares you for the kind of story that follows you home. Not the ones built on feuds or leaked emails or frozen expressions on palace balconies. Those you can file away and forget by morning. This one is different. This is the kind of story that finds you at 2 a.m. when the house has gone quiet and you start listening for things you never thought to listen for before. It started with a routine structural inspection at Adelaide Cottage, the modest house on the Windsor estate that William and Catherine had chosen precisely because it was not a palace. No grand staircases, no gilded corridors, no rooms named after monarchs. Just a house with a garden where 3 children could grow up with mud on their shoes and something that looked from a certain angle like an ordinary childhood. Engineers came in to look at the foundations, standard work on an old building, clipboards, instruments, the kind of methodical afternoon that is supposed to produce a maintenance report and nothing more serious. 17 minutes in, it stopped being an afternoon. Running beneath that cottage was a network of underground passages older than the house itself. Parts of the stonework dated back to the English Civil War. Every survey ever conducted on that property missed it. Every security sweep missed it. Every official record going back decades carried no mention of it whatsoever. But the tunnels were not the thing that emptied that house at midnight. Sources close to the investigation have since suggested that the passages alone would have been a headache for the engineers and a weekend of paperwork for the security team. What drove that family out of their beds and into waiting cars with the engines already running was what the engineers found inside those passages. I am going to hold that back for a few minutes, because if I give it to you now, you will hear it as an isolated detail and move on. Stay with me, and you will hear it the way that family heard it. A quick word before we go further. I am Harold. I follow this family through the filings, the official records, the stories that get buried before anyone finishes asking the questions that needed asking. What you are about to hear is me putting those pieces together as I read them. Subscribe if this is the kind of reporting you come here for, and stay until the end because the last part of this is where everything lands. Now the timeline, a Tuesday in late November, 1:45 a.m. William and Catherine had gone up to bed around 3 hours earlier. George, Charlotte, and Louis were asleep. The sensors installed inside the walls of Adelaide Cottage registered movement in a location where nothing should have been moving. William woke first. That fits the man. Years of military training rewired the way he sleeps, and the small change in air pressure as protection officers began working through the lower corridors was enough to pull him out of it. Catherine came awake seconds later, the way mothers do. Neither of them spoke. 2 people who have spent their entire adult lives under observation learn early that in the first minute of a crisis, keeping quiet tells you more than asking questions. The knock at the bedroom door was soft, and it did not stop. William crossed the room and opened the door to Marcus Headley, the head of their personal protection detail, standing in the corridor with a face that had already delivered the message before his mouth opened. 3 more officers held positions behind him in the hallway. Nobody was sending this family back to bed with a reassurance. Headley told them that the structural engineers had found evidence of recent human activity in the spaces beneath the house, not from a century ago, not from 50 years back. Recent activity, repeated activity, tools with no rust on them, footprints in dust that had not had time to settle, empty water bottles with purchase dates from the previous month, a folding chair, clean, a thermal blanket, and photographs. Photographs of the Wales family going about an ordinary day, taken from angles that told you the person holding the camera knew their schedule. Somebody had been sitting underneath that house while the family slept above it, and that person had been doing it for a while. Headley put it to William in 5 words. Sources close to that corridor have since indicated that William repeated those words back to his wife exactly as he heard them. They were under the house, not at the gate, not over the wall, not in the trees with a long lens, like every other person who has ever tried to get close to that family. Under the floor of the room where his children sleep. Hold that, because you now know what they found in the dirt. You do not yet know who put it there, and you do not yet know how long he had been down there. That second answer is what emptied Windsor, and I will get to it before the end. Catherine was already moving toward the children's rooms before Headley finished the briefing. That detail is the one that stays with me. She did not wait for the rest of it. She did not ask a single follow-up question. The moment she understood that the question on the table was her children's safety, she was in the corridor. George, Charlotte, and Louis had to be woken gently, dressed quickly, and moved somewhere secure while investigators worked out the size of what was sitting beneath their bedrooms. Catherine has built a public image out of steadiness. In that hallway, the steadiness held, but only just. Behind it stood the woman who runs every decision about those 3 children through a single filter: what happens to them. William stood in the doorway, watching her move from bed to bed. Her voice stayed low, and even while she explained to 3 confused children that they were going on an adventure in the middle of the night. George, 11 years old, already understands that his family comes with complications other families never encounter. Charlotte, 9 and sharper than most people give her credit for, asked the question that cut straight through the story her mother was trying to build. "Are we safe here, Mommy?" Catherine paused. Half a second, no more. William saw it from the doorway, and he understood exactly what that half-second cost her. The evacuation ran clean. Security teams rehearse these scenarios constantly and hope to spend their careers without ever using them. William carried Louis down the stairs, 6 years old, and still half asleep against his father's shoulder. Catherine came behind, with a hand on each of the older children. Staff had already pulled the essential bags from the lists that get updated 4 times a year and stored in places that nobody has to go searching for at midnight. That detail alone tells you something about the level of preparation running beneath the surface of that family's ordinary life. 3 vehicles waited on the drive with engines running and routes already agreed. And this is the image I keep coming back to. A woman on her own gravel drive in the November cold, a coat pulled over what she went to bed in, one of her son's shoes in her hand because it came off on the stairs, smiling down at 3 frightened children so they would not panic. Grown men in earpieces standing in the dark around her. The Princess of Wales on her own doorstep being moved out of her own home. Catherine turned for one last look before she got into the car. That house had been a deliberate choice. She and William picked Adelaide Cottage over grander options so their children could have gardens instead of galleries and bedrooms instead of staterooms. They moved the family there in 2022, and every newspaper in Britain covered it as the 2 of them giving their children something closer to a normal childhood. Now the house stood behind her in the dark with its warm windows, and it had become something she did not recognize. William's hand found hers. I keep thinking about the man carrying the 6-year-old down those stairs because there is another woman in this story who used to carry 2 small boys through the middle of the night. Diana did it to get her sons out of a palace and into the real world for an hour, down to a burger place, into a car with no crest on the door, anywhere the job could not reach them. Her son was carrying his own boy through the dark for the opposite reason. Same staircase feeling, same 2 arms, and the job had found him anyway. The motorcade pulled out at 43 minutes past midnight and left behind a property that was already becoming 3 things at once: a crime scene, an archaeological site, and a security failure that somebody was going to have to explain to the king, to the government, and eventually in some carefully sanded down version to the rest of the country. By dawn, white forensic tents stood on the lawns at Adelaide Cottage, each one positioned over an entrance to the network beneath. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Wright got the call at midnight and came in for 2 reasons: her record on historical property crime and a clearance level that allowed her to work inside the particular rules that govern anything touching that family. Her team went in with ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging equipment. If you have not come across it before, ground-penetrating radar is what surveyors use to locate voids beneath solid ground without opening it up, and it is the reason this whole thing came apart in a single night rather than over a decade. The map they built was worse than anyone expected. The passages did not stop at Adelaide Cottage. They ran on and connected to Windsor Castle itself and to 4 other properties on the estate, Frogmore Cottage and Royal Lodge among them. Sit with that for a moment. For years, and possibly for considerably longer than years, there was a way of moving around the Windsor estate that went underneath every gate, every checkpoint, every camera, and every system built by people who spend their professional lives thinking about how someone might try to reach the royal family. And not one person on the payroll knew it existed. The tunnels themselves could be addressed. Old Stone does not attack anybody, seal the entrances, install sensors, close the file. The reason this crossed from an infrastructure problem into a national security incident was the evidence that someone had been using those passages repeatedly and recently. In one chamber, sitting directly beneath the room where Prince Louis sleeps 20 feet above, investigators found a camp. Someone had set himself up down there with a chair, a blanket, and enough water to stay for an extended period, and more photographs. Not archive images, not historical material. Recent photographs of that family living their lives, and the selection told you what the person taking them was focused on. The school run, Catherine's morning route across the estate. The narrow window each day when protection officers change shift and the grounds go quieter than at any other hour. Nobody lands on that pattern by accident. That is somebody doing homework. I want to put one thing alongside another here, because you cannot talk about this family in photographs without it. William has spent his entire life being photographed by men whose faces he never saw. He was 15 years old in September 1997, in a dark suit, walking behind his mother's coffin through central London while the world took photographs of him doing it. He learned before he could drive that a camera pointed at his family is not a neutral object. 28 years later, a man was lying in the dirt under his son's bedroom with a lens, studying the times of day when nobody was watching. William took updates every hour through that first day. He and Catherine had taken the children to Kensington Palace, and he was not unaware of the particular irony in that, since the entire point of Windsor had been to get the children out of a palace and into a house. They sat in the apartment that used to be home and tried to explain to 3 sets of questioning eyes why nobody was going back to Adelaide Cottage yet. The investigation moved at the speed that anything touching that family moves, and at the same time it had to crawl, because half of what came out of the ground had historical value. Every object had to be photographed, logged, and assessed twice, once for what it meant to counter terrorism, and once for what it meant to the archive. Dr. Helena Ashworth from the Royal Collection Trust found herself working alongside counterterrorism officers, and her knowledge of Tudor and Stuart building methods turned out to be the most useful thing in the tent. She was the only person present who could explain how those passages had stayed off every modern survey. By the middle of the afternoon, the team had a rough picture. The network predates Adelaide Cottage by a long way, at least the 1600s, and probably earlier. Parts of it show wear consistent with the Second World War, when Windsor was hardened against a German invasion that never came, and 2 young princesses called Elizabeth and Margaret spent the Blitz behind those walls. Then, somewhere in the decades after, the knowledge went, not destroyed, misfiled, boxed, shelved, catalogued under the wrong heading, forgotten by the last person who ever had reason to look at it. Royal property archives are vast, and nobody has ever finished reading them. The question hanging over every officer in those tents by evening was the same question Charlotte had asked her mother in the dark. Somebody had found those tunnels again. Somebody had gone to the trouble of getting equipment down there and staying. That man had a reason, and until investigators had his name, They had no way of knowing what the reason was. King Charles took his briefing at Clarence House. In front of staff, he kept his face still. On the phone to his son shortly afterward, sources suggest he did not bother. That reaction makes sense when you consider what Charles has lived through. In 1982, a man named Michael Fagan walked into Buckingham Palace, got as far as the Queen's bedroom, and sat on the end of her bed while she kept him talking and waited for someone to arrive. That story is a matter of public record, and it has shaped royal security planning for 4 decades. More recently, as the BBC reported, a man named Jaswant Singh Chahal climbed into the grounds of Windsor Castle on Christmas Day 2021 carrying a crossbow. The Old Bailey sentenced him in October 2023. Both of those men came over the wall. Everything built since is designed around people coming over the wall. This one came from underneath. That is why the king's voice changed. There is a second reason it landed on Charles the way it did, and it has a name. The last time this family lost control of who was pointing a camera at them, it ended in a tunnel in Paris in August 1997 and a funeral at Westminster Abbey 9 days later. Charles walked behind that coffin with 2 boys aged 15 and 12. 30 years on, his son rings him at midnight to say that a stranger has been photographing his grandchildren from a hole in the ground. Nobody in that phone call had to say her name. In that family, they never do. By that evening, MI5 had joined the investigation, which gave the team resources no protection unit carries on its own. Agents began the slow work of pulling 6 months of security footage and looking for the same face appearing too often. The same car parked too long with a clean line of sight to Adelaide Cottage. The digital forensics team worked through the photographs recovered from the underground chamber, stripping metadata, identifying the camera model, building a profile of a man who had put serious time and serious money into watching a family he had never met. I'm going to hold one piece of information back a little longer, because the forensics team already had it by that first evening, and it took another 2 days to reach the family. If I give it to you now, it is a number, and you will hear it as a number. Wait, and you will hear it the way Catherine heard it in a briefing room with a cup of tea going cold in front of her. Catherine spent that day trying to hold the shape of an ordinary Tuesday around 3 children who knew perfectly well that nothing was ordinary. George's questions got sharper as the hours passed. He understands enough about how his own security works to know the difference between a burst pipe and a midnight evacuation. He had already worked out that nobody moves 3 children out of a house at midnight over a burst pipe. William found his eldest son standing at a window looking out over Kensington Gardens, shoulders squared, and the posture went through him like a current because he has seen the photograph of himself doing exactly that. The conversation between the 2 of them was short, and it was honest. William decided years ago that he would not repeat the emotional distance he grew up inside, that his children would be able to bring him a question or a fear without having to route it through anyone else. That commitment got tested in a corridor at Kensington Palace by an 11-year-old who wanted to know whether the man was still out there. Diana is the reason that promise exists at all. She was the one who told her sons things straight, who let them see the parts of the world the household would rather have kept off the schedule, who decided that a boy is better served by the truth than by a polished version of it. William has said as much in public, in his own words, more than once. In that corridor, he had to work out how much truth an 11-year-old can carry when the truth is that a stranger had been lying under his bed for 2 winters. His mother never had to answer that particular question. He did. I am going to leave the 2 of them at that window for a moment, because the next thing the investigators pulled out of the ground is what turns this from a break-in into something I still find difficult to say out loud. Day 3 brought the material that changed the nature of the case entirely. The recovery teams pulled documents from the tunnels stored in waterproof containers by someone who cared about keeping them dry. Maps from different centuries, marked up, cross-referenced, annotated in a handwriting that got smaller and tighter as the pages went on. That is not the work of a man taking photographs of a princess. That is the work of a man chasing something. Professor James Harrington, a historian who has spent his career on royal properties and the architectural elements that never make it onto public plans, came in to read the documents. He emerged from that room unsettled in a way that archive work does not usually manage. The annotations pointed at treasure, specifically at the idea that royalists had hidden valuables underground during the Civil War to keep them from Parliament, and that some of it never came back up. Jewels and gold sitting beneath Windsor for nearly 400 years, waiting for the right man with the right map. That theory circulates widely online. It does not exist in any archive Harrington has ever worked in, and the person who wrote those notes had stopped being a researcher some time ago and become a believer. William sat across the table from Detective Chief Inspector Wright while she walked him through the profile as it stood. The intruder, and by then nobody in that room was using a softer word, knew how to read historical documents. He had access to survey equipment that cost real money. He had the patience to run surveillance above ground and exploration below it across a long period without tripping a single alarm. And then Wright reached the part that changed the temperature in the room. Deeper in the system, in chambers reached by crawling through gaps barely wide enough for a grown man, the search teams found older camps. Not last month, not last year. Items dating back close to 2 years, 2 winters, 2 Christmases with a tree visible in the cottage window, 2 summers with 3 children running in and out of the garden above, and underneath all of it, a man in the dark, writing in a notebook. The journals came up in poor condition and went straight to the transcribers. The handwriting deteriorates as the volumes progress, and that deterioration on the page maps neatly onto the man's descent underground. It is the detail Harrington said he will not forget. Catherine's reaction to each new briefing was the controlled fury of a mother who had just learned that the one boundary she thought she still held had never been there. She had made her peace with the loss of privacy a long time ago. The cameras at every engagement, the opinions about her clothes, the strangers with theories about how she raises her children. All of it she absorbed as the cost of the life she married into. This was different in kind. A man had been underneath her sleeping children for 2 years, watching, waiting, and working towards something that nobody had yet been able to name. And the decision about going home had stopped being a decision about locks. Every room would need sweeping for devices. The whole property would need the kind of upgrade that turns a home into an installation. The exact quality that had made Adelaide Cottage the right choice, its modesty, its position among trees rather than behind walls, had become the reason it could no longer protect anybody. Nobody has said in public what Catherine was thinking when she was told about the 2 years. Watch what she did next, though. She never set foot in that house again as a resident. Charles called a meeting at Buckingham Palace and put security chiefs, senior household staff, and government officials in the same room. Those meetings are usually exercises in mutual reassurance. This one was blunt because the question on the table had gone well past one cottage. If the ground under Windsor had been forgotten and then used, what is sitting under the rest of it? The Tower of London stands on medieval foundations. Hampton Court has Tudor bones beneath its floors. Buckingham Palace itself has been built, partially demolished, and rebuilt so many times that nobody alive has seen a complete plan of what runs beneath it. Then came the part that every royal security discussion eventually arrives at, the press. Reporters had already noticed that the Wales family was absent from Adelaide Cottage, that the school run had changed shape, that something was happening at Windsor behind a screen of white tents. Somebody had to decide how much of the truth could go out without handing a guide to the next man with a theory and a shovel. William and Catherine sat together that evening at Kensington Palace after the children finally went down, and they said the thing to each other that they had been walking around for 3 days. They had chosen a smaller house to give their children a bigger life. That choice had a cost neither of them had calculated. Nobody blamed anyone in that conversation. They both know that every decision about how to raise those 3 comes with a trade, and some trades only show you the bill years later. By that point, the investigation had a face. Footage analysis kept returning to the same man, somewhere in his late 40s, appearing near Adelaide Cottage often enough that no analyst was going to call it coincidence. His vehicle led them to a rented cottage 3 miles from Windsor. Officers arrived to find it empty and left in a hurry. He had known. Somehow, within hours of the discovery, that man knew his tunnels had been opened and he was gone. The search that followed used resources normally reserved for terrorism cases. The logic was straightforward. He knew royal properties. He had surveillance equipment. He had spent 2 years underground pursuing something that nobody had yet fully identified. The not knowing was reason enough to put everything into finding him. And now I owe you the thing I held back at the start. The break came from a place that says a great deal about how this kind of obsession develops now. A moderator on an online forum about royal history flagged a run of posts that had been worrying him for 18 months. The account posted under the name Windsor Truth Seeker detailed theories about treasure beneath royal property, maps that looked very much like the annotated pages sitting in an evidence room in Berkshire. Dr. Miranda Foster, a psychologist who works on obsessive behavior and the one-sided attachments people form with public figures, went through the digital record. The progression she found follows the same arc she has tracked in this work for 20 years. Interest becomes study. Study becomes theory. Theory becomes grievance. And somewhere along that line, the man stops being a person reading about the royal family and becomes the main character of a story in which the royal family is personally hiding something from him. The name came out of the archives in the end, the same way the tunnels did. Malcolm Ricks, 47 years old, formerly a curator at a small historical society in Kent. His colleagues had watched him become increasingly erratic for a year before the society let him go, 3 years before any of this happened. After that, he had no job to go to, and he gave the whole day, every day, to royal properties. He was good at it. That is the part that made him dangerous rather than simply sad. He could read a 17th century architectural plan. He knew how to work an archive without leaving a footprint. He had the training to find a door that fell off the records 400 years ago, and he had nothing else in his life to think about. Somewhere in that solitude, he crossed a line. He came to believe that the Wales family was standing between him and a discovery that would restore his name and prove that the historical society had wronged him. 3 children asleep in a cottage became, in the story he was telling himself underground, an obstacle. The journals confirmed it once the transcribers got through them. Ricks was spending 8 and 10 hours at a time in the tunnels. He wrote about preferring it down there. The dark suited him. The silence suited him. He felt closer to the history he was hunting than he ever had in a reading room. The entries about the family begin as observation. Times, routines, weather. Then they change. He starts writing about them the way you write about people you know, and the man had never spoken a word to any of them. Foster's assessment used the term parasocial once and then set it aside because the plain version is stronger. He had built relationships in his head with a woman and 3 children who did not know he existed, and he built them entirely from photographs taken through a lens from a place they could not see. William read that assessment and understood the shape of the problem straight away. Sensors do not fix this. Cameras do not fix this. A man who gave 2 years of his life to being underneath your house is not a man who reads about the police finding his camp and goes back to a normal life. Ricks was still out there. He is the reason the rest of this story goes the way it goes. Catherine had the hardest conversation of her years as a mother in the days that followed. George had picked up enough from half-heard adult sentences to understand that someone had been watching them, that person had been under the house, and that nobody had caught him yet. She had to find a version of the truth that an 11-year-old could carry without it following him into every dark room for the rest of his childhood. There is no good version of that conversation. There is only the one where you tell your son the truth and then stay in the room. The security upgrades at Adelaide Cottage went in fast. Nobody simply sealed the entrances. Every one of them got sensors calibrated to the smallest disturbance. The grounds received additional cameras and monitoring equipment that would make the same approach almost impossible for the next person. All of it necessary, all of it correct, and every single addition took the house one more step further from the reason they moved there. Meanwhile, the investigation widened, because someone had to ask whether Hicks had been working alone. The online forums he inhabited turned out to be a world most people never see. Whole communities built on theories about that family, with a culture of encouraging each other one step further past every line, all in the name of a truth that exists nowhere except in the thread. The children carried the experience in their own ways, and this is the part I find hardest to cover lightly. Louis had nightmares about monsters in the ground. He is 6. His mind took a midnight evacuation and produced the only story that fits at that age. Catherine sat with him night after night, explaining that the ground is just ground. Charlotte went the other way. She started checking doors, then checking them again. A 9-year-old walking a house at bedtime, confirming the windows are shut, is a small thing to watch and a very large thing to carry. George went quiet and started reading his parents' faces for the worry they were working hard to keep off them. By the 3rd week, the family had arrived somewhere no security upgrade could reach. Even with Hicks still at large, even with every entrance sealed and every room swept, Adelaide Cottage had changed in their heads. The house itself had done nothing. The rooms were the same rooms. The garden was the same garden. The knowledge was what ruined it. 2 years of a man lying under the floor while the family slept above him, and no amount of concrete puts that back in the box. William and Catherine began talking about alternatives, and both of them found the conversation quietly humiliating in ways they did not say out loud. A different property on the estate, one without 4 centuries of forgotten stonework beneath it. Kensington Palace, full-time, trading space and quiet for the security that comes with a building someone has monitored continuously since before either of them was born. The decision, when it came, went out in the language of infrastructure. A strategic relocation, while comprehensive works are carried out at Adelaide Cottage. Both of them understood the translation. They were being moved out of their own home by a man neither of them had ever met. The morning they left, it rained. Gray, flat November rain that gets into a day and stays. The statement went to the press that afternoon, worded to give the public enough to answer the headline without handing anyone a map. The Prince and Princess of Wales are relocating their primary residence to allow for comprehensive infrastructure and security works at Adelaide Cottage, expected to take several months. By evening, it was everywhere. Front pages. Photographers standing in the rain at the Windsor gates, filming an empty driveway. Every outlet in Britain running the same footage of white tents on a lawn and reading the same bland words about infrastructure to an audience that understood perfectly well that nobody moves 3 children out of a house in November over a maintenance issue. Members of the public came and stood at the gates with flowers, which is what this country does when it does not know what else to do. The pictures of those flowers ran next to pictures of the tents. A family that had chosen that house to get away from exactly this ended up watching their worst night of the year become the 10 o'clock news. The commentary started within the hour because it always does. People who have never stood on that drive explaining to a 9-year-old why she has to put her shoes on at midnight had strong opinions about whether the security had been adequate, whether the move to Windsor had been a mistake from the beginning, whether the whole thing was being oversold. Panels, columns, former officers with diagrams. Catherine watched some of it. Sources close to her say she stopped on the second day, after a presenter used the word overreaction to describe the decision to carry her son out of his bedroom in the middle of the night. The children had been prepared over the preceding days in versions matched to their ages. George understood the most and asked about the investigation with a precision that told his parents where his mind had been going at night. Charlotte made her peace with the move faster than anyone expected, and that steadiness will serve her for the rest of her life. Louis, still young enough to accept almost anything as long as his parents looked steady, wanted to know which toys were coming and whether the new place had a garden. Catherine walked through Adelaide Cottage on her own before she left, with the protection team keeping their distance in the way they have learned to. Every room had something in it. The kitchen, where she had attempted ambitious birthday cakes and produced ordinary weeknight dinners, and found in that the one part of her life that connects her to every other mother in the country. The sitting room, where film nights became a family institution. The bedrooms, where 3 babies became 3 people with opinions. None of it was erased. All of it was tainted, and she understood the difference between those two things. William did his own walk, and he did it like an engineer. The works going in were necessary, and he had approved all of them. He also knew they were going to change what the place is. Adelaide Cottage will come out of this more monitored than it has ever been, and it will feel like everywhere else they have ever lived. Whether either of them will ever want to walk back through that door is a question neither of them put into words. The move ran like an operation. Kensington Palace was familiar ground, the London base throughout the Windsor years. Now it had to be the home, which is a different job for a building and a different adjustment for the people inside it. Charles came to see them on the 3rd evening. A private dinner, no diary entry, and by every account a conversation about family and security and the impossible business of keeping anything ordinary while living the way they live. He spoke from long experience of adjusting his own life around threats. He told them what he had learned, which is that every generation gets its own version of the same problem. The hunt for Ricks kept going and kept producing nothing. A nationwide alert, a public appeal. He had planned for the possibility of being found with the same care he had planned everything else. The rented cottage told them more than he would have wanted. Research going well beyond Windsor. Detailed work on Sandringham and Balmoral, which reads as a man who was not finished. Foster updated her assessment with a line that put a chill through the investigation. Isolation combined with obsession, combined with public humiliation, and having his tunnels taken from him counted as one, tends to push a person from watching toward doing. The weeks after the move showed the family the full size of what they were carrying. George became more serious. He started asking about protocol, about how his own protection works, and every question was a boy realizing that this is not an incident. This is his whole life. Charlotte stopped wanting to sleep alone. Catherine sat with her every night until she went under, and never once suggested she was too old for it. Louis adjusted fastest, the way 6-year-olds do, and every so often he asked when they were going back to their real house. Neither of his parents had an answer for him. Catherine found herself grieving something larger than a building. Adelaide Cottage was a plan. It was the answer to a question she and William had asked themselves before George was born. Whether it is possible to raise royal children with any fragment of a normal childhood intact. That plan now looked naive to her, and the guilt that came with that assessment made no sense and would not leave, which is how guilt works in mothers. William carried his own version, sharpened by the one thing he cannot change. He will be king. His family will always be the object of someone's obsession, and no amount of care in how he raises his children alters that. He has spent his adult life trying to hold duty and fatherhood inside the same house, and a man with a folding chair in the dark had made the whole attempt feel very thin. By late December, there was a shape to the days again. The children settled into new routines. The schools took their briefings. William and Catherine returned to public duties with a practiced steadiness that gets mistaken for coldness by people who have never had to do it. Adelaide Cottage sat empty at Windsor while contractors worked on it, officially on the infrastructure and unofficially on a problem no contractor can fix. The tunnels can be sealed, the sensors can go in. Every technical measure on the list can be signed off and paid for. The knowledge stays. Somebody was down there in the dark under the floor while 3 children slept, and the man who put himself there is still somewhere in Britain with maps of Sandringham in his head. On Christmas Eve, with the children asleep and the palace quiet, William and Catherine stood at a window looking out over Kensington Gardens and talked the way parents talk when they finally get 20 minutes. The year ending, the children, the spring, where they will be living in it. Neither of them said the obvious thing, which is that Adelaide Cottage is probably finished for them, not lost to a threat anyone could name, lost to knowing. Diana used to take her boys out at night to see London when nobody expected it, because she wanted them to have 1 hour that belonged to them and not to the country. She spent her life being followed by men with cameras, and she died with a camera pointed at the car. Her son bought a small house with a garden, so his own children would never learn what that feels like. A man with a lens took it from him from underneath. Malcolm Hicks never found his treasure. There is nothing under Windsor except old stone and water, and there never was. He gave up his career, 2 years of his life, and whatever was left of his mind chasing gold that does not exist. The only thing he successfully removed from that estate was a family's belief that they were safe in their own beds. He is out there tonight, somewhere, still convinced he is the hero of it. That is what he is. A man who took 3 children's home away and found nothing.